My name is Emma, and at 28 years old, I thought I had finally escaped the shadow of my older sister's perfection. That was until I found my own wedding invitations crumpled at the bottom of our kitchen trash can, coffee grounds clinging to the elegant ivory cardstock that had taken me months to choose. The discovery of who put them there would shatter everything I believed about my family and force me to confront a truth I had been running from my entire life. Growing up in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, population barely scraping 8,000, everyone knew everyone else's business. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Our house sat on Maple Street, a modest two-story home with blue shutters and a front porch that my mother, Linda, kept adorned with seasonal decorations. My father, Robert, managed the local hardware store that his father had opened back in 1952, and our family was considered respectable middle-class folk who attended St. Mary's every Sunday and never missed a town council meeting. My sister Victoria was 3 years older than me, and from the moment I could form coherent thoughts, it became clear that she was everything I was not. Where I was average height with mousy brown hair that refused to hold a curl, Victoria stood tall and elegant with naturally golden blonde hair that seemed to catch sunlight even on cloudy days. She excelled in school effortlessly, maintaining a perfect grade point average while simultaneously serving as student council president, captain of the debate team, and prom queen during her senior year. I, on the other hand, struggled to maintain B averages despite hours of studying, joined clubs only to quit them after a few meetings, and spent most of my high school years blending into the background. Victoria graduated as valedictorian and received a full scholarship to Penn State, where she studied business administration and met her future husband David during their sophomore year. David came from a wealthy family in Philadelphia, his father owning a successful chain of restaurants throughout the state. While Victoria was building her picture-perfect life at university, I was still at home, working part-time at the local diner after graduating high school and taking community college classes that I wasn't particularly passionate about. My parents had always been supportive, or so I thought, but there was an undeniable difference in how they spoke about their daughters. Victoria's achievements were announced at family gatherings, shared with neighbors, and celebrated with elaborate dinners. My small accomplishments, like making the dean's list at community college or getting a promotion to shift supervisor at the diner, were acknowledged with a pat on the shoulder and a brief "good job, honey." The dynamic became even more pronounced when Victoria and David got engaged during their senior year of college. The announcement was made at Sunday dinner with a 24-karat gold engagement ring that sparkled like something out of a jewelry store advertisement. My mother immediately burst into tears of joy, and my father stood up to shake David's hand with more enthusiasm than I had ever seen him display. The next several months were consumed with wedding planning, and our house became headquarters for what my mother referred to as the event of the century. Victoria's wedding was indeed spectacular. Held at the grand ballroom of the Riverside Country Club, with 300 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, and flowers flown in from 3 different states. I served as a bridesmaid, wearing a dusty rose gown that Victoria had chosen specifically because it complemented her color scheme perfectly. During the reception, I watched as toast after toast was made about the happy couple, about Victoria's beauty and intelligence, about David's success and bright future. My parents glowed with pride as they danced with their accomplished daughter and her successful husband. After the wedding, Victoria and David moved to Philadelphia, where David joined his father's restaurant business, and Victoria landed a position at a prestigious marketing firm. They purchased a stunning colonial house in an exclusive suburb, complete with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool. Holiday gatherings at our house became showcases for Victoria's latest achievements, her promotions, their vacation photos from Europe, and eventually, the announcement that they were trying to start a family. Meanwhile, I had transferred to a 4-year university about an hour away, where I was studying elementary education. Teaching had always appealed to me because I enjoyed working with children and felt like I could make a real difference in young lives. However, my choice of major was met with polite indifference from my family. Teaching was considered a noble profession, but not particularly impressive or financially rewarding. When I brought boyfriends home, they were nice enough, but they were studying things like computer science or working at local businesses, nothing that would elevate our family's social standing the way David's restaurant empire had. During my junior year of college, I met Michael at a campus coffee shop where he worked part-time while pursuing his degree in social work. Michael was different from anyone I had ever dated. He had warm brown eyes, an infectious laugh, and a passion for helping others that reminded me why I had chosen teaching in the first place. He came from a working-class family in a neighboring town, and his father was a mechanic while his mother worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Michael's family was close-knit and genuine, the kind of people who hugged you when you walked through their door and insisted you stay for dinner even if you had only stopped by for a few minutes. When I brought Michael home to meet my parents for the first time, the contrast between their reception of him and their reception of David years earlier was stark. They were polite but distant, asking basic questions about his studies and his family, but showing none of the enthusiasm they had displayed when getting to know David. My mother's smile seemed forced, and my father spent most of the evening discussing business with Michael in a way that felt more like an interrogation than a conversation. After Michael left that evening, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and what she called a heart-to-heart conversation. She explained that while Michael seemed like a perfectly nice young man, I should consider whether he was really the type of person who could provide the kind of life I deserved. She reminded me of Victoria's success and happiness, suggesting that perhaps I should aim for someone with more ambitious career goals or from a more established family background. The conversation stung because it implied that Michael, who was one of the kindest and most genuine people I had ever met, was somehow not good enough for our family. It also suggested that I, unlike Victoria, needed to aim higher to compensate for my own perceived shortcomings. I defended Michael and our relationship, but my mother's words planted seeds of doubt that would grow over the following months. Despite my family's lukewarm reception of Michael, our relationship continued to flourish throughout our senior year of college. We supported each other through final exams, job interviews, and the stress of planning our post-graduation lives. Michael landed a position with a nonprofit organization that worked with at-risk youth, while I was hired as a third-grade teacher at an elementary school about 30 minutes from Millbrook. We found a small apartment together, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable, and we were genuinely happy building our life together. Victoria, meanwhile, had given birth to twin boys, Christopher and Alexander, who immediately became the center of my parents' universe. Every phone conversation with my mother included detailed updates about the twins' latest milestones, accompanied by dozens of photos that she shared with anyone who would look at them. Victoria had taken a temporary leave from her marketing job to focus on motherhood, but even this decision was praised as evidence of her dedication and excellent priorities. When Michael and I had been together for 3 years, living together for 2, and both established in our careers, he proposed during a weekend trip to a cabin in the Pocono Mountains. It was not an elaborate proposal with flash mobs or professional photographers, but it was perfect for us. He had packed a picnic lunch, and we hiked to a scenic overlook where he got down on one knee and asked me to marry him with a simple but beautiful solitaire ring that he had been saving up for months to buy. I called my parents immediately after saying yes, expecting them to share in our excitement. My mother's response was measured congratulations, followed by questions about our timeline, our budget, and whether we had really thought this through carefully. My father's reaction was similarly restrained, offering his blessing, but with a tone that suggested he was not entirely convinced this was the right decision. The contrast with their reaction to Victoria's engagement was impossible to ignore. Planning our wedding became an exercise in managing expectations and navigating family dynamics. Michael and I wanted something simple and meaningful, perhaps a ceremony at the local community center followed by a reception in my parents' backyard. We were both paying for the wedding ourselves, as Michael's parents had limited financial resources, and my parents had not offered to contribute significantly to the costs. Victoria, on the other hand, had opinions about everything from the venue to the menu to the guest list. She suggested that having the reception in our parents' backyard might look a bit informal and recommended that we consider borrowing money to upgrade to a proper venue. She also mentioned that David's business connections might be uncomfortable with the casual atmosphere we were planning, and perhaps we should reconsider our approach to make the event more sophisticated. My mother seemed torn between supporting my vision for our wedding and managing Victoria's concerns about how the event would reflect on the family. She made subtle suggestions about upgrading various aspects of the celebration, from the flowers to the photographer to the dinner menu, all while emphasizing that she just wanted everyone to have a wonderful time. The underlying message was clear: our simple celebration might not live up to the standards that Victoria's wedding had established for family events. The guest list became another source of tension. Michael and I wanted to invite close friends and family members, keeping the celebration intimate and personal. However, my parents had a list of family friends, business associates, and community members who they felt should be included. Victoria added her own suggestions, including several couples from David's social circle who barely knew Michael and me, but who she felt would expect an invitation based on their relationship with the family. As the wedding planning progressed, I began to feel like the event was slipping away from Michael and me and becoming something designed to meet other people's expectations rather than celebrate our love and commitment. Every decision seemed to require approval from multiple family members, and our original vision of a simple, heartfelt ceremony was being transformed into something more elaborate and formal than we had ever wanted. The stress of wedding planning began to take a toll on my relationship with Michael. He was frustrated by what he perceived as my family's interference and their lack of genuine enthusiasm for our marriage. I found myself caught between defending my family's behavior and acknowledging that their treatment of him was often dismissive and condescending. We had several arguments about whether to scale back the wedding to something more manageable or to continue trying to accommodate everyone's expectations. 3 months before our wedding date, Victoria announced that she and David were expecting their third child. The news was met with even more celebration than the twins' birth had been, and suddenly our wedding seemed to take a back seat to preparations for the new baby's arrival. Family conversations that had previously focused on wedding details shifted to discussions about nursery preparations, baby names, and Victoria's pregnancy symptoms. I tried to maintain enthusiasm for my sister's pregnancy while also keeping our wedding plans on track, but it became increasingly difficult to get my family's attention for important decisions that needed to be made. When I needed my mother's help addressing wedding invitations, she was busy helping Victoria register for baby gifts. When I wanted to discuss the rehearsal dinner timeline with my father, he was occupied with planning a baby shower for Victoria that would take place just 2 weeks before our wedding. The final straw came when Victoria called me 3 weeks before our wedding to inform me that her doctor had recommended she avoid travel during her 3rd trimester, which meant she might not be able to attend our ceremony. She explained that her pregnancy had been more challenging than her previous ones, and she needed to prioritize her health and the baby's well-being. While I understood her concerns, the timing felt deliberately calculated to overshadow our special day. When I shared Victoria's news with my parents, their reaction confirmed my worst fears about where their priorities lay. My mother immediately began discussing the possibility of postponing our wedding until after the baby was born, so that Victoria could be present for the ceremony. My father suggested that we could have a small ceremony as planned, and then hold a larger celebration later when Victoria was available to attend. The suggestion that we should rearrange our wedding to accommodate Victoria's pregnancy was the breaking point for me. I had spent months compromising on details, accepting suggestions that didn't align with our vision, and watching as our celebration became increasingly focused on meeting other people's expectations rather than honoring our relationship. The idea that we should now postpone or modify our wedding date because Victoria might not be able to attend felt like the ultimate confirmation that her needs would always come before mine in our family's hierarchy. I told my parents firmly that we would not be changing our wedding date, and that while we would miss Victoria if she couldn't attend, our ceremony would proceed as planned. This decision led to several tense phone conversations where my mother accused me of being selfish and inconsiderate of my sister's condition. My father expressed disappointment in my unwillingness to be flexible for the sake of family unity.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Michael watched these family dynamics unfold with increasing frustration and concern. He had always known that Victoria held a special place in my family, but witnessing how easily they were willing to suggest altering our wedding plans to accommodate her pregnancy made him question whether I would ever be treated as an equal in my own family. He began to suggest that perhaps we should elope or have a much smaller ceremony with just his family and a few close friends. The idea of eloping became increasingly appealing as our wedding date approached and family tensions continued to escalate. Michael's family had been nothing but supportive and excited about our marriage, welcoming me into their circle with genuine warmth and enthusiasm. His mother had offered to help with any aspects of the wedding planning, and his father had quietly slipped us some money to help with expenses despite their own financial limitations. The contrast between his family's unconditional support and my family's conditional acceptance based on how well our choices aligned with their preferences was becoming impossible to ignore. I began to wonder whether the wedding we were planning was really a celebration of our love, or simply an obligation to fulfill family expectations that would never truly satisfy anyone involved. 2 weeks before our wedding, as I sat in our apartment surrounded by wedding favors that needed to be assembled and final details that needed to be confirmed, I made the decision to stop trying to please everyone and focus on what Michael and I actually wanted for our special day. I called my mother and informed her that we were scaling back several aspects of the celebration, reducing the guest list to immediate family and close friends, and simplifying the reception menu. My mother's reaction was immediate and intense. She accused me of making last-minute changes that would embarrass the family and disappoint guests who were expecting a more elaborate celebration. She reminded me of all the time and effort that had gone into planning the wedding and suggested that I was being ungrateful for the support I had received. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me after declaring that she would need time to think about whether she could support a wedding that reflected so poorly on our family's values. That night, as Michael and I discussed the latest family drama, I realized that I had been so focused on trying to earn my family's approval and acceptance that I had lost sight of what really mattered. Our wedding was supposed to be a celebration of our commitment to each other, not a performance designed to impress people who would never be satisfied with our choices anyway. The next morning, I called my mother back and attempted to have a calm conversation about our wedding plans. I explained that Michael and I wanted our celebration to reflect our values and our relationship, not necessarily the expectations that others might have for us. I assured her that we appreciated everyone's input and support, but that ultimately we needed to make decisions that felt authentic to who we were as a couple. My mother's response was cold and distant. She informed me that she and my father would attend the wedding because it was their obligation as parents, but that they were disappointed in the choices I had made and the way I had handled the planning process. She suggested that perhaps I had been influenced too much by Michael's family's approach to celebrations and had lost sight of what was appropriate for someone from our background. The accusation that Michael's family had somehow corrupted my judgment was particularly hurtful because his family had been nothing but kind and supportive throughout our relationship. They had never tried to impose their preferences on our wedding plans or criticize our choices. Instead, they had simply offered their love and assistance in whatever way we needed it. As our wedding week approached, the tension with my family reached a breaking point when Victoria called to inform me that she had decided she definitely could not attend our ceremony. However, she wanted to make sure that her absence wouldn't affect the family photos and suggested that we could Photoshop her into the pictures later. The suggestion was so absurd and hurtful that I could barely respond coherently. The idea that Victoria thought she could be digitally inserted into our wedding photos rather than make the effort to attend our actual ceremony felt like the ultimate symbol of how disposable my important moments had always been in comparison to hers. I told her that we would not be manipulating our wedding photos and that her absence, while disappointing, would simply be something we would have to accept. The conversation with Victoria ended with her accusing me of being unreasonable and suggesting that my attitude about her pregnancy complications showed a lack of family loyalty. She reminded me of all the times she had been there for me during difficult periods in my life, conveniently forgetting the many times when her own celebrations and achievements had overshadowed my important moments. That evening, Michael found me crying in our bedroom as I stared at the wedding invitations we had finally finished addressing and were planning to take to the post office the next morning. The beautiful ivory cardstock with elegant black lettering that we had chosen together suddenly seemed to represent all the family drama and disappointment that had consumed our wedding planning process. Michael sat beside me on the bed and took my hand, reminding me that regardless of my family's behavior, we were getting married because we loved each other and wanted to build a life together. He suggested that perhaps their approval wasn't as important as I had always believed it to be, and that real family support should feel encouraging rather than conditional. His words forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding for years. My family's love and support had always come with conditions and expectations that were impossible to meet. No matter how much I achieved or how hard I tried to earn their approval, I would never be Victoria, and they would never celebrate my successes with the same enthusiasm they showed for hers. The realization was both devastating and liberating. It meant acknowledging that I had spent most of my life chasing acceptance that was never truly available to me, but it also meant that I could stop trying so hard to earn something that wasn't going to be freely given anyway. As I fell asleep that night, holding the wedding invitations that represented both our love and my family's disappointment, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stop trying to manage other people's expectations and start prioritizing my own happiness and Michael's feelings about our wedding. The next morning, I woke up feeling more determined and peaceful than I had in months. Michael had already left for work, and I had planned to spend the day running final wedding errands, including mailing our invitations to the post office. I gathered the stack of carefully addressed envelopes and headed downstairs to grab a quick breakfast before starting my busy day. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed that the trash can seemed unusually full, with some papers sticking out of the top. My mother was known for being meticulous about household organization, so it was unusual to see the garbage overflowing. I pressed down on the contents to make room for my coffee filter, and that's when I saw the corner of ivory cardstock peeking out from beneath some crumpled newspapers. My heart stopped as I realized what I was seeing. I carefully pulled the papers aside and found our wedding invitations, all of them crumpled and stained with coffee grounds and food scraps. The elegant black lettering was smudged, and some of the envelopes were torn from being stuffed into the trash. Every single invitation that Michael and I had spent hours addressing and preparing was ruined. I stood frozen in the kitchen, holding the damaged invitations in my trembling hands, trying to process what had happened. Someone had deliberately taken our wedding invitations and thrown them away. Someone in my own family had sabotaged our wedding by destroying the invitations that were supposed to announce our celebration to the people we cared about most. The discovery felt like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me and leaving me gasping for air. These weren't just pieces of paper, they represented months of planning, our excitement about sharing our special day with loved ones, and our commitment to each other. Someone had literally thrown our wedding into the trash. I spent the next hour sitting on my kitchen floor, carefully separating each ruined invitation and trying to salvage what I could. Some were completely destroyed, the addresses smeared beyond recognition, while others had minor damage that might be fixable with careful cleaning. My hands shook as I worked, a combination of fury and heartbreak making it difficult to focus on the delicate task. Michael's invitation to his grandmother, whom he adored and who had been so excited about our wedding, was torn in half. My college roommate Sarah's invitation was stained with what looked like marinara sauce from last night's dinner. The invitation meant for my favorite aunt, the one family member who had always shown genuine interest in my life, was crumpled into a tight ball that had been stuffed deep into the garbage. As I worked to clean and sort through the damage, my mind raced with questions about who could have done this and why. The invitations had been sitting on the dining room table when I went to bed, carefully arranged in alphabetical order and ready to be taken to the post office. Someone had to have come into the house during the night or early morning, deliberately gathered every single invitation and thrown them away. The front door had been locked when I came downstairs, and there were no signs of forced entry. This wasn't a random act of vandalism by a stranger. Someone with access to our house, someone who knew exactly what those invitations represented, had made a conscious decision to destroy them. The realization made my stomach turn with a sick feeling that went beyond simple anger. I considered the possibilities as I continued my salvage operation. My parents had a key to the house, as did Victoria, though she lived over an hour away and was supposedly too pregnant to travel. Michael's parents also had a spare key, but the idea of his gentle mother or hard-working father sneaking into our house to sabotage our wedding was so absurd, I dismissed it immediately. The most logical explanation was that one of my immediate family members had done this, someone who felt so strongly about our wedding that they were willing to go to extreme lengths to disrupt our plans. The thought that my own family could betray me in such a personal and hurtful way was almost too painful to process. I called in sick to work, knowing that I couldn't possibly focus on teaching third graders while dealing with this crisis. Instead, I spent the morning at my computer, trying to recreate the invitation list from memory and figuring out how to rush order replacement invitations that could be printed and mailed in time for our wedding, which was now less than 2 weeks away. The process was expensive and stressful, requiring me to pay expedited shipping fees and printing costs that strained our already tight wedding budget. More importantly, it meant that some of our guests might receive their invitations with barely a week's notice, making it difficult for them to plan to attend our celebration. When Michael came home for lunch, he found me surrounded by damaged invitations, printing estimates, and a guest list that I was frantically trying to reconstruct. His face went pale as I explained what had happened, and I watched his expression shift from disbelief to anger to something that looked like deep sadness. He knelt beside me on the kitchen floor and carefully picked up one of the ruined invitations, examining the coffee stains and torn edges with a mixture of fascination and horror. This was his grandmother's invitation, the one that had been torn in half, and I could see the pain in his eyes as he realized that someone had deliberately destroyed something that represented his family's inclusion in our celebration. Michael had always been patient with my family's behavior, making excuses for their coolness toward him and their obvious preference for Victoria's husband. He had endured awkward dinners where he was barely included in conversations, family gatherings where his accomplishments were dismissed or ignored, and countless subtle slights that I had tried to convince myself were unintentional. But this was different. This wasn't passive disapproval or subtle dismissiveness. This was an active attempt to sabotage our wedding, to prevent our friends and loved ones from celebrating with us. It was malicious and deliberate, designed to cause maximum damage to our relationship and our special day. We spent the rest of the afternoon working together to rush order new invitations and compile a complete guest list. Michael suggested that we should confront my family immediately, demanding to know who was responsible and why they had done this. I hesitated, partly because I was afraid of the answer, and partly because I wasn't sure how to handle such a confrontation. That evening, I decided to start by calling my mother. I needed to know if she had any idea what had happened to our invitations, and I wanted to gauge her reaction when I told her about the discovery. Perhaps her response would give me some clue about whether she was involved or if she knew who was responsible. My mother answered the phone on the second ring, her voice cheerful and normal. She asked about my day and mentioned that she had been shopping for a new dress to wear to our wedding. Her casual tone and apparent lack of knowledge about the destroyed invitations made me wonder if I had been wrong to suspect her involvement.
I took a deep breath and explained what had happened to our wedding invitations. I described finding them in the trash, the extent of the damage, and the stress of having to rush order replacements. I watched her face carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign of guilt or prior knowledge about the situation. My mother's reaction seemed genuinely shocked and concerned. She gasped at the appropriate moments, expressed sympathy for our situation, and immediately offered to help with the cost of replacement invitations. Her response appeared so authentic that I began to doubt my assumption that she was involved in the sabotage. However, when I mentioned that someone with access to our house must have been responsible, my mother's demeanor shifted slightly. She became more defensive, asking why I would assume that a family member was involved rather than considering other possibilities. She suggested that perhaps we had accidentally thrown the invitations away ourselves, or that they had been misplaced rather than deliberately destroyed. The suggestion that Michael and I might have accidentally thrown away our own wedding invitations was so ridiculous that it confirmed my suspicions that my mother knew more than she was admitting. No one accidentally throws away a stack of carefully addressed wedding invitations, especially not the bride and groom who had spent hours preparing them. When I pressed her about who else might have had access to our house, my mother became increasingly uncomfortable. She mentioned that Victoria had been feeling better recently and had driven down to visit a friend in a nearby town earlier that week. The information was offered casually, but something in her tone suggested that she was revealing more than she intended to. I asked directly if Victoria had stopped by our house during her visit to the area. My mother's pause before answering was telling, and when she finally responded, her explanation was vague and evasive. She said that Victoria might have mentioned stopping by to drop off a baby gift for us, but she wasn't sure if that had actually happened. The conversation ended with my mother promising to ask Victoria about whether she had been to our house recently. She also offered again to help with the replacement invitation costs, which struck me as an unusually generous gesture from someone who had been critical of our wedding budget from the beginning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation with my mother, analyzing every pause and inflection for clues about what she knew and when she knew it. The possibility that Victoria had been responsible for destroying our invitations was almost too painful to consider, but it also made a terrible kind of sense. Victoria had always been competitive with me, though she had never had much reason to be given her superior position in our family hierarchy. But perhaps my upcoming wedding represented something that threatened her status as the perfect daughter with the perfect life. Maybe she couldn't stand the idea of me having a celebration that might draw attention away from her pregnancy and her expanding family. The next morning, I decided to drive to Victoria's house and confront her directly. I needed to see her face when I asked about the invitations, and I wanted to give her the opportunity to explain herself if she was indeed responsible. Michael offered to come with me, but I felt that this was something I needed to handle alone, at least initially. The drive to Victoria's suburban Philadelphia home took me through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, past houses that grew larger and more impressive as I approached her exclusive development. Her colonial mansion sat on a perfectly manicured lot, complete with professional landscaping and a circular driveway that could accommodate multiple luxury vehicles. I had always felt intimidated by Victoria's home, not just because of its size and elegance, but because it represented everything that my parents admired and valued. This was the kind of success they had hoped I would achieve, the kind of lifestyle they had envisioned for both their daughters. My modest apartment and teaching salary paled in comparison to Victoria's obvious prosperity. Victoria answered the door wearing an expensive maternity dress that somehow managed to make her pregnancy look glamorous rather than uncomfortable. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless despite the fact that it was barely 10 in the morning. She seemed surprised to see me, but invited me in with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her living room was decorated like something from a home design magazine, with coordinated furniture, fresh flowers, and family photos displayed in elegant silver frames. The photos showed Victoria and David at various social events, vacation destinations, and family gatherings. Notably absent were any pictures that included me, despite the fact that we had attended many of the same family functions over the years. Victoria offered me coffee and pastries from an expensive bakery, playing the role of gracious hostess while I struggled to find the right words to begin our conversation. She asked about wedding preparations with what seemed like genuine interest, commenting on how stressful the final weeks before a wedding could be. I decided to approach the subject indirectly, mentioning that we had encountered some problems with our invitations that had forced us to rush order replacements. Victoria's expression remained neutral, as she asked what kind of problems we had experienced. Her voice was perfectly modulated, showing appropriate concern, without revealing any prior knowledge of the situation. When I explained that our invitations had been destroyed and thrown away, Victoria's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She gasped, covered her mouth with her hands, and expressed shock and sympathy for our situation. Her performance was so convincing that I almost began to doubt my suspicions again. However, when I mentioned that the destruction had to have been deliberate and that someone with access to our house was responsible, Victoria's demeanor changed subtly. She became more animated in her suggestions about alternative explanations, proposing scenarios involving burglars, disgruntled postal workers, and even neighborhood children playing pranks. Her eagerness to deflect suspicion away from family members struck me as suspicious, especially since her suggested alternatives were far less plausible than the obvious explanation that someone close to us was responsible. I decided to be more direct in my questioning, asking specifically if she had been to our house recently. Victoria's answer was carefully crafted, but revealed more than she probably intended. She acknowledged that she had been in the area earlier that week, visiting a college friend, and had considered stopping by to see us. However, she claimed that she had ultimately decided against it because she was feeling tired and wanted to get home before dark. The explanation might have been believable, if not for the specific details she provided about her decision-making process. She mentioned that she had driven past our house and noticed that both of our cars were in the driveway, which meant we were home. She had even considered calling to see if we were free for a quick visit, but had decided against it because she didn't want to interrupt anything important. The level of detail in her story suggested that she had indeed been to our house, or at least cased it carefully. More troubling was her knowledge that both of our cars had been in the driveway, which indicated that she had observed our house closely enough to notice specific details about our vehicles. I pressed her about the timing of her visit to the area, asking what day she had been driving past our house. Victoria became increasingly uncomfortable with my questions, claiming that she couldn't remember exactly which day it had been because her pregnancy was affecting her memory. She suggested that perhaps I should focus on moving forward with the replacement invitations rather than dwelling on who might have been responsible for the destruction. Her suggestion that I should simply accept the sabotage and move on, rather than seeking accountability for what had happened, confirmed my growing suspicion that she was involved. An innocent person would have been outraged on my behalf, and eager to help identify the perpetrator. Victoria's desire to change the subject and discourage further investigation spoke volumes about her potential guilt. I decided to try a different approach, mentioning casually that we were considering installing security cameras around our house to prevent future incidents. Victoria's reaction to this suggestion was telling. She became visibly agitated, asking whether we really thought such measures were necessary, and suggesting that cameras might make our neighbors uncomfortable. Her obvious distress at the idea of security cameras reinforced my suspicion that she had been the one to destroy our invitations. Someone who was innocent would have supported our desire to protect our home and belongings. Victoria's concern about cameras suggested that she was worried about being caught if she attempted any future sabotage. As our conversation continued, Victoria became increasingly defensive and hostile. She accused me of being paranoid and suspicious, suggesting that my stress about the wedding was causing me to imagine conspiracies where none existed. She reminded me that family members who loved and supported me would never deliberately hurt me, which struck me as particularly ironic, given the circumstances. The conversation reached a breaking point when Victoria suggested that perhaps the destruction of our invitations was a sign that we should reconsider our wedding plans altogether. She mentioned that planning a wedding while dealing with family tensions was probably not healthy for any of us, and maybe postponing the celebration would give everyone time to work through their differences. Her suggestion that we should postpone our wedding because of the very sabotage that I suspected her of committing was so audacious that it took my breath away. She was essentially arguing that her own destructive actions should be rewarded with the exact outcome she had presumably been trying to achieve, the disruption or delay of our wedding. I stood up to leave, no longer able to tolerate her manipulative suggestions and false concern. Victoria followed me to the door, continuing to offer advice about how to handle the invitation situation, and expressing hope that everything would work out for the best. Her parting comment was that she hoped I would remember that family was more important than any single event, no matter how special it seemed at the time. The drive home gave me time to process what I had learned from my conversation with Victoria. While I still didn't have concrete proof that she had destroyed our invitations, her behavior and responses had raised enough red flags to convince me that she was likely responsible. Her knowledge of our house, her defensive reactions to my questions, and her eagerness to discourage further investigation all pointed to her guilt. More troubling than her potential involvement in the sabotage was her apparent belief that she was justified in her actions. Victoria seemed to genuinely think that our wedding was somehow threatening or inappropriate, and that she had the right to take action to protect the family's interests, as she saw them. When I arrived home, Michael was waiting with updates on the replacement invitation situation. He had managed to expedite the printing process, and we would be able to pick up the new invitations the following day. However, the rushed timeline meant that some of our guests would receive very short notice about our wedding. I shared the details of my conversation with Victoria, and Michael listened with growing anger and disbelief. He had never particularly liked my sister, finding her pretentious and condescending, but he had never imagined that she would go to such lengths to sabotage our wedding. The realization that someone in my own family had deliberately tried to hurt us was devastating for both of us. That evening, we discussed whether to confront Victoria directly with our suspicions, or to simply move forward with our wedding plans and limit her access to our lives going forward. Michael favored the direct confrontation approach, feeling that we deserved an explanation and an apology for what had been done to us. I was torn between wanting answers and fearing what those answers might reveal about my family relationships. If Victoria had indeed destroyed our invitations, it meant that her disapproval of our marriage ran much deeper than I had realized. It also raised questions about my parents' knowledge of her actions and their potential complicity in the sabotage. The next morning brought another surprise that complicated our situation further. My mother called early, before I had even finished my first cup of coffee, with news that she claimed would solve all of our problems. Victoria had apparently offered to pay for upgraded invitations and expedited mailing services, ensuring that all of our guests would receive beautiful professional invitations with adequate notice. My mother presented this offer as evidence of Victoria's generosity and concern for our happiness. She suggested that Victoria felt terrible about our invitation problems and wanted to help make sure that our wedding was everything we had dreamed it would be. The offer was positioned as a sisterly gesture of love and support during a difficult time. However, I recognized Victoria's offer for what it really was, an attempt to buy her way out of accountability for her actions. By paying for replacement invitations, she could present herself as the generous sister who had saved our wedding, while simultaneously ensuring that any investigation into who had destroyed the original invitations would be discouraged. The offer also served another purpose. It would put Victoria in control of our invitation process. If she paid for the replacements, she would have input into the design, the guest list, and the timeline for mailing. She would essentially be able to manage our wedding communications in a way that served her interests rather than ours. I declined Victoria's offer firmly, explaining to my mother that Michael and I preferred to handle our own wedding arrangements. My mother's reaction was immediate and intense. She accused me of being prideful and ungrateful, suggesting that I was allowing my ego to prevent my sister from helping during a crisis. The conversation revealed another troubling dynamic in my family relationships. My mother seemed more concerned with maintaining the appearance of family harmony than with addressing the underlying issues that had created our current situation. She was willing to accept Victoria's offer at face value, without questioning why my sister suddenly felt compelled to be so generous, or how she had learned about our invitation problems so quickly. When I suggested that perhaps we should investigate who had destroyed our original invitations before accepting help from anyone, my mother became defensive and angry. She accused me of being suspicious and paranoid, echoing Victoria's words from our conversation the day before. The similarity in their responses suggested that they had discussed the situation and coordinated their approach to managing my questions. The realization that my mother and Victoria might be working together to cover up the sabotage was almost more painful than the original destruction of our invitations. It meant that multiple family members were prioritizing the protection of Victoria's reputation over accountability for her actions and concern for my feelings. I spent the rest of the day feeling isolated and betrayed by the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally. Michael's family had rallied around us when they learned about our invitation problems, offering both practical help and emotional support. The contrast between their genuine concern and my own family's manipulative behavior was stark and heartbreaking. That afternoon, we picked up our replacement invitations and spent hours addressing them carefully. The new invitations were beautiful, but they represented much more than just wedding announcements. They symbolized our determination to celebrate our love despite the obstacles that others had placed in our path. As we worked together to prepare the new invitations for mailing, Michael and I talked about what we had learned about my family dynamics and how they might affect our future relationship with my parents and Victoria. The sabotage had revealed patterns of behavior and loyalty that we could no longer ignore or excuse. We decided that moving forward, we would need to establish much clearer boundaries with my family. Their conditional support and manipulative behavior had caused too much stress and pain to be acceptable in our lives. Our wedding would proceed as planned, but our relationship with my family would never be the same. The new invitations were mailed the next day, carrying with them our hope that our friends and loved ones would join us in celebrating our commitment to each other. Despite everything that had happened, we were more determined than ever to have a wedding that reflected our values and our love, surrounded by people who genuinely wanted to share in our happiness. As our wedding date approached, we focused on finalizing the details that would make our celebration meaningful and joyful. We had learned painful lessons about family loyalty and conditional love, but we had also discovered the strength of our partnership and our ability to overcome obstacles together. The destroyed invitations had been intended to damage our relationship and disrupt our wedding, but instead they had revealed the true nature of the people around us and strengthened our resolve to build a life based on authentic love and mutual respect. The breakthrough came 3 days before our wedding, when Michael's cousin Jake called with information that would finally give us the proof we needed. Jake worked as a delivery driver for a local courier service and had been making rounds in our neighborhood the morning after our invitations disappeared. He had seen Victoria's distinctive silver Mercedes parked in our driveway at 6:30 in the morning, which struck him as odd since he knew we usually left for work much later. Jake hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming Victoria was dropping something off or picking something up for our wedding preparations. However, when Michael mentioned our invitation troubles during a family gathering, Jake remembered the early morning sighting and realized its potential significance. He had debated whether to share this information, not wanting to cause family drama, but ultimately decided we deserved to know what he had witnessed. The timing of Victoria's visit coincided perfectly with when our invitations would have been accessible, and when we would have been asleep upstairs, unaware of any activity in our main living areas. Jake's account provided the missing piece of evidence that confirmed our suspicions about Victoria's involvement in the sabotage. Armed with this concrete proof, I called Victoria and demanded an immediate explanation. This time I didn't approach the conversation with careful diplomacy or indirect questions. I told her exactly what Jake had seen and asked her to explain why she had been at our house at 6:30 in the morning without our knowledge or permission. Victoria's initial response was denial, claiming that Jake must have been mistaken about the car or the timing. She suggested that perhaps he had seen someone else's silver sedan and assumed it was hers. However, when I mentioned specific details about her vehicle that Jake had noticed, including a distinctive dent in the rear bumper from a recent parking lot accident, her denials became less convincing. As I pressed her for the truth, Victoria's composure finally cracked. She began crying, not the manipulative tears I had seen her use to garner sympathy in the past, but genuine sobs that seemed to come from a place of deep emotional turmoil. Through her tears, she began to confess what she had done and why she had felt compelled to do it. Victoria admitted that she had taken our spare key months earlier, during a family dinner at our house, and had made a copy for herself. She claimed that her original intention had been to surprise us with helpful gestures, like cleaning our house before the wedding or decorating for celebrations. However, as our wedding date approached and her own insecurities intensified, she had begun using the key for surveillance purposes. She revealed that she had been coming to our house periodically when we weren't home, going through our mail, looking at our wedding planning materials, and monitoring our preparations. Her behavior had escalated from curiosity to jealousy to active sabotage as she struggled with feelings of inadequacy and fear that our wedding might overshadow her own life achievements. The confession was devastating, not just because of what Victoria had done, but because of the deep-seated resentment and insecurity that had motivated her actions. She admitted that despite her seemingly perfect life, she had always felt threatened by my independence and happiness. My ability to find contentment outside of our family's approval structure had challenged her own need for constant validation and recognition. Victoria explained that our wedding had become a symbol of everything she feared about losing her position as the favored daughter. She worried that my marriage to Michael would create a new family dynamic, where her achievements and milestones would no longer be the primary focus of family attention. The idea that our celebration might generate genuine excitement and happiness had been unbearable to her. Through her tears, Victoria described feeling increasingly desperate as our wedding date approached. She had tried to undermine our plans through subtle manipulation and criticism, but when those efforts failed to dissuade us from proceeding, she had decided that more direct action was necessary. Destroying our invitations had been intended to force us to postpone or cancel the wedding altogether. The revelation that Victoria's sabotage had been motivated by her own insecurities rather than genuine concern about our relationship was particularly painful. She hadn't acted out of love or protective instincts, but out of selfish fear that our happiness might diminish her own importance within the family structure. As Victoria continued her confession, she also revealed that our mother had known about some of her surveillance activities. While our mother hadn't been directly involved in destroying the invitations, she had been aware that Victoria was struggling with jealousy about our wedding and had encouraged her to find ways to be more involved in our celebration. The discovery that our mother had known about Victoria's inappropriate behavior and had failed to discourage it was another layer of betrayal. Instead of setting appropriate boundaries or encouraging Victoria to address her insecurities in healthy ways, our mother had essentially enabled the escalating surveillance and manipulation. Victoria's confession also included details about other instances of interference that we hadn't been aware of. She admitted to calling some of our vendors and requesting information about our contracts, claiming to be helping with family coordination. She had also contacted several of our friends, ostensibly to discuss gift ideas, but actually to gather information about our relationship and their opinions about our compatibility. The extent of Victoria's invasion of our privacy was staggering and went far beyond the destruction of our invitations. She had systematically violated our boundaries and our trust in ways that we were only beginning to understand. Her behavior had been obsessive and calculated, not the impulsive actions of someone having a momentary lapse in judgment. When I asked Victoria what she expected to happen now that she had confessed, her response revealed that she still didn't fully understand the gravity of what she had done. She seemed to believe that her apology and explanation would somehow restore our relationship and allow us to move forward as though nothing had happened. Victoria suggested that we could put this incident behind us and focus on being a supportive family during the remaining days before our wedding. She offered again to pay for upgraded reception decorations or additional services, apparently thinking that financial gestures could compensate for her violation of our trust and privacy. Her inability to recognize that her actions had fundamentally changed our relationship was almost as troubling as the original sabotage. Victoria seemed to view her confession as the end of the problem, rather than the beginning of a much larger conversation about boundaries, respect, and family dynamics. I ended the phone call by telling Victoria that I needed time to process what she had told me and to discuss the situation with Michael. I made it clear that her confession, while appreciated, didn't automatically repair the damage she had caused or restore the trust she had violated. There would be consequences for her actions that extended beyond simple apologies. When I shared Victoria's confession with Michael, his reaction was a mixture of vindication and disgust. He felt validated that our suspicions had been correct, but he was appalled by the extent of Victoria's surveillance and manipulation. The revelation that she had been monitoring our lives for months made him feel violated and unsafe in our own home. Michael's immediate concern was about our security and privacy going forward. He wanted to change all of our locks, install security cameras, and take other measures to ensure that Victoria could never again access our home without permission. He also suggested that we should consider involving law enforcement, since Victoria's actions constituted breaking and entering an invasion of privacy. I was torn between wanting to protect ourselves and wanting to avoid the family chaos that would result from involving outside authorities. The idea of having my sister arrested just days before our wedding was overwhelming, even though her actions certainly warranted serious consequences. We decided to compromise by immediately changing our locks and installing basic security measures, while postponing any decisions about legal action until after our wedding. Our priority was ensuring that our celebration could proceed safely and without further interference, rather than dealing with the complex legal and family ramifications of Victoria's behavior. The next step was confronting our parents about their knowledge of Victoria's actions and their failure to intervene when they became aware of her inappropriate behavior. This conversation was even more difficult than dealing with Victoria directly, because it forced us to address the fundamental dysfunction in our family dynamics. When I called our parents and requested an emergency family meeting, their immediate assumption was that I wanted to discuss some last-minute wedding detail or logistics issue.
They seemed surprised when I insisted that the conversation needed to happen in person and that it concerned Victoria's behavior rather than our celebration plans. The meeting took place at our parents' house the following evening, with Victoria reluctantly present at our request. The atmosphere was tense from the moment we arrived, with everyone seeming to understand that this was not going to be a typical family gathering focused on wedding excitement and preparation. I began by sharing what we had learned about Victoria's surveillance and the destruction of our invitations. Our parents' initial reactions were shock and denial, with our father insisting that there must be some misunderstanding, and our mother suggesting that perhaps Victoria's pregnancy hormones were affecting her judgment. Their attempts to minimize and excuse Victoria's behavior were exactly what I had expected, but still deeply disappointing. Even when faced with concrete evidence of their daughter's serious misconduct, their first instinct was to protect her reputation and avoid accountability rather than acknowledge the harm that had been done. As the conversation continued, it became clear that our mother had indeed known more about Victoria's activities than she had initially admitted. She acknowledged that Victoria had expressed concerns about our wedding and had asked for advice about how to be more involved in our preparations. However, she claimed that she had no idea Victoria's involvement would escalate to surveillance and sabotage.
Our father's response was primarily focused on damage control and reputation management. He was concerned about how Victoria's behavior might reflect on the family if it became known in our small community. His questions centered around who else knew about the situation and whether we intended to share details with extended family members or mutual friends. The lack of genuine concern for the emotional impact of Victoria's actions on Michael and me was striking. Our parents seemed more worried about managing the family's public image than addressing the underlying issues that had led to this crisis or supporting us through the aftermath of our trust being violated. When I expressed my disappointment in their response and their failure to hold Victoria accountable for her actions, our mother became defensive and accusatory. She suggested that perhaps Michael and I were overreacting to what amounted to family drama, and that we should focus on forgiveness and moving forward rather than dwelling on past mistakes. The suggestion that we were overreacting to systematic invasion of privacy and deliberate sabotage was so insulting that it confirmed my growing realization that our family relationships were fundamentally unhealthy. Our parents' inability to recognize the seriousness of Victoria's behavior meant that they could not be trusted to support appropriate boundaries or consequences going forward. Our father attempted to broker a compromise by suggesting that Victoria should formally apologize and make financial restitution for the cost of replacement invitations and security measures. He seemed to view the situation as a business dispute that could be resolved through negotiation rather than a serious violation of trust and boundaries. Victoria's own response during the family meeting was a combination of self-pity and continued justification for her actions. She maintained that her behavior had been motivated by love and concern for the family, and that she had never intended to cause serious harm. She seemed genuinely surprised that we weren't willing to accept her apology and move on immediately. The meeting ended without any real resolution or accountability. Our parents promised to think about appropriate consequences for Victoria's behavior, while Victoria herself continued to minimize the impact of her actions. It became clear that expecting genuine accountability or meaningful change from our family was unrealistic. Michael and I left our parents' house feeling more isolated from my family than ever before. The meeting had confirmed that they were incapable of providing the support and validation we deserved in this situation. Their loyalty to Victoria and their concern for family image took precedence over justice, boundaries, and our emotional well-being. As we drove home, we made the difficult decision to proceed with our wedding while significantly limiting our family's involvement and access to our lives going forward. We would not allow Victoria's sabotage to derail our celebration, but we also would not pretend that our relationships with my family could continue unchanged after what had happened. The final days before our wedding were spent focusing on the positive aspects of our upcoming celebration and the people who genuinely supported our relationship. Michael's family rallied around us with increased warmth and inclusion, essentially adopting me as their own daughter and ensuring that I felt loved and celebrated despite my own family's failures. Our friends responded to the replacement invitations with enthusiasm and understanding, many of them expressing outrage on our behalf when they learned about the sabotage. Their genuine excitement about our wedding reminded us of what family support should look like and helped us maintain perspective about what really mattered. On our wedding day, Victoria attended as planned, playing the role of supportive sister for the benefit of extended family and friends who remained unaware of what had transpired. Her presence felt surreal and uncomfortable, but we had decided that excluding her would create more drama than including her with strict boundaries and limited access. Our parents also attended, maintaining the facade of a happy, supportive family while carefully avoiding any meaningful interaction with Michael or acknowledgement of the recent crisis. Their behavior throughout the celebration was performative rather than genuine, focused on appearances rather than authentic emotion. Despite the underlying family tensions, our wedding day was beautiful and meaningful. We were surrounded by people who truly loved and supported us, celebrating a commitment that had been strengthened rather than weakened by the challenges we had faced together. The sabotage had tested our relationship and revealed the true character of the people around us, ultimately making us more confident in our choices and our future together. As Michael and I danced our first dance as husband and wife, I realized that Victoria's attempts to destroy our happiness had actually clarified what was most important in our lives. We had learned to prioritize our own well-being over family approval, to recognize genuine support from manipulation, and to build our own definition of family based on love and respect rather than obligation and blood relations. The discovery of our destroyed wedding invitations had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. We were no longer bound by the need to earn acceptance from people who were incapable of providing it unconditionally. Our future would be built on the foundation of authentic relationships with people who celebrated our happiness rather than feeling threatened by it. 3 months after our wedding, the true extent of Victoria's manipulation came to light when Michael's grandmother shared something that changed everything. During our delayed honeymoon thank you visits, Grandma Rose mentioned casually that Victoria had called her 2 weeks before our wedding, claiming to be organizing a surprise reception and asking for details about Grandma Rose's dietary restrictions and mobility needs. The conversation had seemed odd to Grandma Rose at the time, especially since Victoria had never shown interest in Michael's family before, but she had assumed it was a genuine gesture of inclusion. It wasn't until she mentioned it to us that we realized Victoria had been gathering information to potentially sabotage our reception as well, perhaps planning to create confusion or conflicts among our guests. This revelation prompted us to reach out to other family members and friends, and we discovered a pattern of similar calls from Victoria in the weeks leading up to our wedding. She had contacted Michael's parents under the pretense of coordinating transportation, called my college friends claiming to plan a surprise shower that never materialized, and even reached out to our photographer asking detailed questions about our timeline and vendor arrangements. The scope of Victoria's interference was far more extensive than we had imagined. She had essentially been conducting a campaign of information gathering and potential sabotage across our entire social network. Her actions went beyond jealousy or sibling rivalry into something that resembled obsessive surveillance and control. When we confronted our parents with this new information, their response was to suggest that we were dwelling on the past and that Victoria's pregnancy stress had made her behave irrationally. They proposed a family therapy session to work through our differences and restore harmony to our relationships. The suggestion that we needed therapy to accept Victoria's stalking and manipulation was the final confirmation that our family would never provide the accountability and support we deserved. Their willingness to excuse increasingly serious behavior rather than address it directly meant that Victoria would likely continue her pattern of interference in our lives. Michael and I made the difficult but necessary decision to implement a complete no-contact policy with Victoria and limited contact with our parents. We changed our phone numbers, blocked all social media connections, and informed our mutual friends and extended family that we would not be participating in any gatherings where Victoria was present. The decision was painful but liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from the constant stress of managing Victoria's jealousy and our parents' favoritism. Our marriage flourished without the toxic family dynamics that had been undermining our happiness and security. 6 months later, we received a formal letter from an attorney representing Victoria demanding that we return her spare key and cease making defamatory statements about her character to family members. The legal threat was clearly designed to intimidate us into silence and re-engagement with the family system that had enabled her behavior. Michael's response was to have our own attorney send a cease and desist letter documenting Victoria's harassment, surveillance, and destruction of property, along with a clear warning that any further contact or interference would result in criminal charges and a restraining order. We also documented all of Victoria's past actions and provided copies to our security company and local police as a precautionary measure. The legal intervention effectively ended Victoria's attempts to control our lives. We never heard from her or our parents again directly, though we occasionally received reports through extended family members that they continued to portray themselves as the victims of our unreasonable behavior. A year after our wedding, Michael and I purchased our first home together, a charming cottage in a different town where we could build our life free from family interference. We created traditions and celebrations that reflected our values rather than managing other people's expectations or judgments. Our chosen family expanded to include close friends who became our true support system, Michael's extended family who embraced me completely, and eventually colleagues and neighbors who appreciated us for who we were rather than comparing us to anyone else's achievements or standards. The experience of discovering our destroyed wedding invitations and uncovering the truth about Victoria's behavior taught us invaluable lessons about boundaries, self-worth, and the difference between family by birth and family by choice. We learned that toxic relationships, even with blood relatives, don't have to be tolerated or excused simply because of genetic connections. Most importantly, we discovered that protecting our peace and happiness was more important than maintaining relationships that consistently caused pain and stress. The people who truly belonged in our lives would never ask us to diminish ourselves or accept mistreatment for the sake of keeping the peace. Today our marriage is stronger than ever, built on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine support, and authentic communication. We have created the kind of family environment that nurtures growth and celebrates individual achievements without competition or comparison. Looking back, I'm grateful that Victoria destroyed our wedding invitations because it forced us to confront family dynamics that we might have continued to tolerate indefinitely. Her sabotage inadvertently gave us the clarity and motivation we needed to break free from toxic patterns and build a healthier future. The ivory cardstock that I found crumpled in our kitchen trash can represented more than just destroyed wedding announcements. It symbolized the end of my lifelong pursuit of approval from people who were incapable of providing unconditional love and support. Finding those invitations in the trash was the beginning of finding my true self and my real family. Sometimes the most painful betrayals become the greatest gifts by showing us exactly who deserves a place in our lives and who doesn't. Victoria thought she was destroying our wedding, but she was actually destroying the illusions that had kept us trapped in unhealthy family dynamics for years. Our wedding day was perfect not because everything went according to plan, but because we were surrounded by people who genuinely wanted us to be happy. The destroyed invitations had filtered out the toxic relationships and revealed the authentic love that had been there all along, waiting for us to recognize its value. If you've ever had to choose between being true to yourself and keeping toxic family members comfortable, know that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Real love doesn't require you to shrink or suffer in silence. The people who truly belong in your life will celebrate your happiness, not sabotage it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.